At long last, we are back with Dr. Gaven Kerr. It has been several months since we've had a chat, Gavin. So before we get into it, we're going to talk Aquinas' theory of existence, maybe some divine epistemology and whatever else comes up. But before we dive right in, for people who might not be totally familiar with you, which they should be if they've been following this channel for any stretch of time, give us the brief biography, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Gaven Kerr. I'm a philosopher, lecturer in philosophy at St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth. I've written a few bits and pieces on St. Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, medieval philosophy, metaphysics in general. At Maynooth, I teach philosophy at all levels, from undergraduate right through to postgraduate, and I supervise several doctoral students, one of whom has been on this show, Carlo Broussard, who has passed his doctoral viva and should be graduating in November. So he's Dr. Broussard.
Yeah.
Another of whom might be familiar to some of you is a lady called Stacy Trasankos.
Dr. Trasankos. She's already got her PhD in what is it, chemistry, something like that?
Chemistry.
Yeah, that's great.
So Dr. Trasankos is going to be doing a doctorate with me on the nature of matter and defending holomorphism, again, as the best way to understand contemporary scientific accounts of matter.
Great.
And I've got several other PhD students, another one of whom runs the Dogs with Torches podcast, Nathaniel Hunter Olson.
Oh, very cool. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, as well as that, I'm the academic registrar of this university, and I'm also the acting dean of philosophy. So that's my academic side.
A little busy. Yeah, that's great. Well, okay. So very cool. For people who have not seen some of our previous conversations, I imagine that our chat today will build upon that. So we're going to be, I guess, making several assumptions, and I'll just, gesture to the past 2-3 years that we've been talking about this stuff for people who need to get caught up. But what I'd like to begin chatting with you about today, Gavin, is just Aquinas' general theory of existence, because a lot of how Aquinas thinks about God, Aquinas' philosophical approach to God is it's system dependent, right? Like they're arguments that work within a particular paradigm, and he's got this very, I think, ultimately correct, but interesting view of existence. So I thought two things I want to cover. One is just have you kind of explain how Aquinas thinks about existence, what existence is, and then also how to begin to motivate this theory of existence, where existence is like attributable to concrete individuals. That's one thing, but also as something that is really distinct from the essence of that individual. I mean, to me, those are like the two critical pillars you need. But if you have them, then I think it just really unlocks so much for Aquinas. Does that sound right to you? And
100%. Okay, so Aquinas is sort of a metaphysics of existence, of esse, the act of existence, and the role that has to play in a system. So for the gentle listeners, if they're familiar with the Platonic and Aristotelian sort of positions in philosophy, they were devised in order to answer the problem of the one and the many. And the problem of the one and the many is, how do we explain the unity and the diversity of being, of reality? So when you've got somebody like Heraclitus, who makes an important observation that reality seems to be in a constant state of flux. There is something about reality which exhibits flux and change and lack of unity, lack of stability, all of that. And stability seems to be something that is something that emerges out of the flux. But the flux just seems to be, at the heart of reality. But then you've got Parmenides, and Parmenides held that reality is actually just one. It's unified. And the flux, the change, the multiplicity, that's all just emergent. That's not completely real. What's really real is the unity. So the change, the flux that you think you see isn't actually real. And then you've got all sorts of Zeno's paradoxes to kind of, point out that if we do embrace the reality of change and flux, it leads us into a really paradoxical way of thinking. Classic one is like if you take a line and divide it again and divide it again, you can divide it infinitely. So division and multiplicity leads to kind of, taking a finite line to be infinitely divisible, which is quite, sort of paradoxical. So the best way to, avoid that is to reject the premise on which it is based, that, you can have division and thus multiplicity. So this was a standoff in ancient philosophy. And it was a standoff that Plato and Aristotle inherited. And we had a significant advance in the history of philosophical thinking when both Plato and Aristotle pointed out that reality can be both one and many. There can be both unity and multiplicity. And the way in which they did that was on their peculiar metaphysics of form. That for Plato, beings participate in the forms and ultimately in the form of the good. They're like shadows, shadowing or mirroring the forms, and the form of the good is at the height of all reality. And the closer you are to the good, the more unity you have, the more actuality that you have, and the further away from the good, the less unity, less actuality, greater multiplicity. Aristotle had a similar view, but he just didn't have this participation framework. For Aristotle, the form is present in the thing, and it forms and unifies the matter. So the matter is structured and unified by the form. So you have a single matter-form unit because form relates to matter as actuality to potentiality. Matter is potentially this, that, or the other formed thing. And once it receives the form, it is actually formed in a certain way. So form is a principle of completion for matter. Matter is incomplete without the form. And that's why we say that form actuates matter, because actuality signifies a type of completion. And insofar as form is the principle of that, form is a principle of actuality. It gives actuality to the thing. Now, that was a significant advance in the philosophical problematic. But then that left, again, two opposing positions, both of which had very good things to say, but yet they were opposed positions, Platonism and Aristotelianism. The Neoplatonic tradition came in, headed up by mainly Plotinus, but also Proclus. And the Neoplatonists, they adopted a sort of an Aristotelian ontology about sort of creaturely, earthly things, but this was within a participation framework of all things within the one. And that's famously Plotinus in the Enneads. So the one is the principle of all reality. We have something beyond form, which form even stands in potency to. And that was the central insight of the Neoplatonists, that you need something beyond form, to which even form stands in potency. What is this most fundamental principle of actuality? Well, the Neoplatonists thought it was the one, because everything that exists is a unit. Fast forward to Thomas Aquinas, and St. Thomas has the insight that the most fundamental principle of actuality is not form, it's not the one, because there's something even more fundamental than the one. It's existence, the act of existence, or esse, as he calls it. Existence is the act of all acts, the perfection of all perfections. Without it, there would be nothing. Nothing would be. So that's, bedrock. That's fundamental. And the reason why that's fundamental is because beyond existence, there is nothing. There's metaphysical reality beyond the one, beyond unity, and that's the act of existence. But there's nothing beyond the act of existence. So we've reached the highest point of metaphysical thought on the most fundamental principle of actuality. So that's Thomas's insight, and that's why Thomas is often referred to as an existential thinker.
Yes.
At the heart of his thinking, of his metaphysics, is the act of existence, and that's what gives actuality to all else. Everything stands in potency to it, and the act of existence gives actuality to everything else.
Okay, first off, that was a really great condensed, history of philosophy lesson right there. So might have to just turn that into a short, because that was really cool. All right, so let's go back to the one and the many, because I think this is an area that maybe should be emphasized more. And I was kind of complaining to you about that just in private conversation. Why aren't people? Because sometimes when people, I guess, argue for the real distinction, they focus on various arguments that Aquinas gives, but those arguments already sort of assume Aquinas's general paradigm of existence, right? That existence isn't just what the existential quantifier expresses, for example, right? But with the one and the many, it seems like, well, we have a real motivation here, because, and tell me if you think this is right, but the one and the many is something that crops up at different levels or orders of being.
Yeah.
Right. If we ask how is it that things have something in common, yet they're also different, right? Well, it seems like essence and essence are useful for explaining the commonality, the fact that many types of things are real, but there are many types of things, right? Essence and existence. But then we also have it again at the level of like, you know, types of things and individual instances. And that's where it seems like form and matter are playing the sort of theoretical role. So do you think that's right? Because I guess the main question is like, well, why do I have to go beyond form and matter? And the simplest answer to me seems like, well, it's because the one and the many is a problem that crops up in different sorts of ways, right?
So you have the problem of the one and the many, unity and diversity at the level of individuals, because you have many individuals of the same species. Okay, so you have multiplicity, but unity at the species level. But then you also have many species of the same genus. You have multiplicity at the species level, but unity at the genus level. So we have many men, but one species of humanity. We've got many species of animals, but one genus of animality. And you can make it more and more general and so on and so on. So at different levels of reality, the problem of the one and the many pops up. And so the question then becomes that whilst we can have, you know, we can explain unity and diversity of essences, of the essences of things in terms of, let's say, Aristotelianism. And that's what St. Thomas does. He thinks that we can explain the essence of a thing through hylomorphism. So a thing's essence is its definitional content, and this is constituted out of the composition of its matter and form. But that doesn't show us why there are many existents, because there are lots of essences, okay, which, you know, presumably would be composed of matter and form, which don't exist. Okay, so there are many, many types of things composed of matter and form that we can imagine which don't exist. Okay, so this gets us into the sort of the reasoning and the justification for distinction between essence and existence, because form isn't enough to explain unity because we don't have the unity of existence. That only gives us a unity for essences.
Yeah, all right, that's really good. I mean, it also just seems like profoundly obvious to me, but I guess certain things that seem profoundly obvious to me are still highly controversial in philosophy, right? So must be careful of these highly controversial positions, as you know. I mean, one of the other strategies, and this is sort of like Barry Miller's, right? So he's obviously inspires me a lot. He just like argues like, hey, clearly Aquinas's position is the common sense intuitive position, right? So all I need to do is show you why all the objections against it suck, right? And we're just kind of good to go. And so that isn't true. He does a little bit more. He actually thinks that you could diffuse all the objections, the Kantian ones, and show that there's nothing incoherent about this. But then he actually takes, and I know this is controversial, I actually don't think you sign up on it. He thinks that language is a mirror of ontology. And you get this from a logical analysis of language as well. We don't have to go down that road if you want, but I'll just throw it out there if you want to take a whack at it in any way. I know that the language and ontology mirror thing is something that Thomists are pretty divided on. So
Well, I mean, so to the first issue, that this whole idea that existence is a second order predicate, existential quantifier, not attributable to the individual. That was a very popular position. You know, it comes up, you know, with Kant, that existence is not a predicate, and it comes up in the later analytic philosophers. And the idea here is that when we affirm existence of something, we are just saying that there is an instance of that thing, that there is an instance of doghood, there is an instance of cathood when we say that dogs or cats exist.
Yeah, so in this view, existence is closely tied to number, right? There's at least one of this type of thing, right?
So you're not attributing existence to the individual things that exist. You're attributing existence to the concept, which is instantiated, okay, to that set of predicates, which is instantiated. So existence is a property of properties. You're saying these properties are instantiated in the thing. You're not saying that the thing has existence itself. Now, the problem that I have with that, and that others have had with that, is the thing in itself, which is instantiating these properties, has some ontological value to it, independent of the properties that it instantiates. And what is that ontological value, if not that it exists? Okay, if it didn't exist, it could not instantiate these properties of which we can say that they exist. So the thing itself, which instantiates properties, it itself must exist. And Peter Geach, in a paper I think was titled Form and Existence, points out that even in Frege, who is like kind of the granddaddy of this sort of, existential instantiation view, Frege himself recognized this more fundamental kind of type of existence, a kind of an actuality, whereby you need the individual to be real, to be existing in order to instantiate properties. So that would be the issue that I would have with that sort of second order property instantiation view.
Now, it's also, I think like Vallicella has really demonstrated this, that if you just try to equate existence with instantiation, it's a circular account too, right?
Yeah.
This is a deeply problematic account. I remember Geach also holds, I don't know if you think this is right, I think Miller goes to them too, that Aquinas has a two-sense understanding of existence, right? He does, like, wouldn't deny that there is sense, but there's also the actuality sense of existence. And it's that actuality sense that is more fundamental, right?
Yeah, that's it entirely. That the actuality sense is that the individual has that actuality of existing so that properties can be instantiated in it.
Right. It's that in virtue of which that we can actually count this thing, right?
And without that, you have nothing. And that's what Thomas means by the act of existence, the act of all acts. Now, I mean, swinging back to language and ontology, that whole sort of issue. So I'm one of those Thomists that's heavily influenced by Kant and the neo-Kantian tradition. I generally adopt the view that being is what the intellect first conceives. And I mean, that's St. Thomas de Veritate, question 1, and that's taken from Avicenna, but I mean, that goes right back, to Plato, Aristotle, the ancient Greeks. And this idea that being is what the intellect first conceives is that unless there is something independent of the intellect for the intellect to conceive, the intellect will not operate. Something has to bring the intellect into operation, and that's what being is. So when our intellect engages with being, the intellect isn't already sort of operative in the sense that it's like, a room waiting to be filled by these beings called ideas or representations or concepts. Rather, that just like the eyes, when they open, as soon as they open, light shines in and brings your eyeballs into operation. So too, when the intellect comes into contact with being brings the intellect into operation. So the intellect is active, it's operative in its engagement with reality. I like to think of it, I used the eyeball example there, but I like to think of it kind of like a burglar alarm in a home, that as soon as an intruder is detected, it goes off. So your intellect goes off as soon as it detects being. And I think that's a very Kantian, later Kantian view, that the Kantian categories are recognitional capacities we have for recognizing the intelligible structure of reality. So that when reality comes into contact with us, it sets off these categories, like the category of causality. When causal features in reality come into contact with us, they set off this recognitional capacity for recognizing causal features. And I think that's what Thomas means by the agent intellect.
And that sounds quite Lonergan-ish too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, Lonergan, again, sort of post-Kantian, post-Hegelian reading of St. Thomas, and it's very close to the Pittsburgh school, Sellers, McDowell, and people like that, their reading of Kant. But what that then means is that when we form concepts, the concepts that we form are formed on the basis of the intellect's engagement with reality, that the intellect is being brought into operation, and the form of that operation is the form of what brings it into operation.
Yes.
So our concepts map the conceptual features of reality. Reality has these conceptual or formal features which inform the operations of our intellect. Our language then is used as a tool to communicate those concepts. And insofar as those concepts are reflecting the conceptual features of reality, our language, which is conventional, okay, we devise it, it's an agreement between us as language users, but it's seeking to signify or represent or to get across those conceptual features of reality that we formed by our operations. So language is closely aligned with our concepts and the conceptual features of reality which informs them.
Yeah, so that's great. I think that all sounds totally right to me, and I wonder if that's useful for like somebody like Miller, because I mean he focuses on atomic propositions, right?
Right.
So like Fido is black. He says you have a subject and predicate, but really that's a mirror of the ontology of an object and property, right?
Yeah.
And so when we say Socrates exists, we're going to get a similar analysis, right? So maybe, I don't know if you want to connect those things of how that would work with your, cause I don't know what particular epistemology Miller holds, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, in my creation book, I did a whole deduction of the Aristotelian categories based on language, the theory of predication. But I mean, it followed very closely Thomas's deduction of the categories in the physics and in the metaphysics, and it was based on how we predicate things. We predicate things on the basis of our concepts, and our concepts are formed on the basis of the conceptual features of reality. So when we want to say, Socrates is sitting or something like that, we are conceiving a substance with certain accidental properties.
Yeah.
Okay. And so our language requires us to have some sort of propositional structure in which we can pick out a substance with its accidental properties, in which case, we have predication. Our language is also picking out Socrates exists. That's because we can truthfully say of Socrates, let's say, well, he did exist if he were here. We can truthfully say of Socrates that he does exist, that there is something about Socrates such that he's something rather than nothing. And that's what we're affirming when we say that Socrates exists. But I should say that I think the philosophy of language there, the language is not being used to justify the metaphysics. Okay, you just have to do the metaphysical thinking anyway, but you're expressing the metaphysics in language, and that language is expressing the conceptual features of reality that you're recognizing when you do the metaphysics.
Yeah, good. Okay, that's good, and maybe that'll give people another kind of path to help kind of angle into this. So I think it's a really strong, if not necessary, theory. And then I guess the next thing that we should talk about is, okay, if existence is something that we can attribute to, concrete individuals, why should we think that it is really distinct from the essence of that individual? I know we talked about this before, but I think it's worth retreading, because this is the kind of the second commitment that Aquinas has that just does a ton of work for him, particularly for his arguments for God and stuff like that, but even beyond that. So help us think about this, Gaven, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. So in one of the first works that Thomas wrote, the De Ente et Essentia, in chapter 4 of that, in chapter 4 in most editions, Thomas devises this distinction between essence and existence. And really, he's coming up upon the issue of whether or not matter is the principle of potency. So that if you have something that is immaterial, okay, is it lacking in potency? Is it pure actuality? Utterly simple. And so he's dealing with that issue. And there were thinkers in the Middle Ages, and they adopted the position that in order to avoid saying that immaterial creatures, like angels, for instance, are utterly simple, pure actuality, these thinkers made a distinction between corporeal matter and incorporeal matter. Corporeal matter is bodily matter, and incorporeal matter is non-bodily matter. But both material and immaterial creatures, non-corporeal creatures such as angels, have this matter. And that was a way around of saying that something like angels are just pure actuality. So that keeps matter as the principle of potency and form as the principle of actuality. Now, Thomas has a number of problems with that position, one of which is that it introduces plurality of form, because it means if you've got a corporeal creature, first of all, you have the matter that it has, but that matter needs to be corporealized. So it needs a special form called a form of corporeality that it receives. And then on top of that, it receives its substantial form. So first of all, matter is made bodily, and then a substantial form is given to it, what makes it the type of bodily thing that it is, dog, lion, or cat, or whatever. So it commits one to plurality of form.
Which is a no-go for Aquinas. He thinks that's
Yeah.
incoherent, right?
Yeah. He has lots of argumentation against plurality of form. Now, one of the things is that the plurality of form view, it does an awful lot of work in Christology. It's really handy for Christology. But Thomas has a lot of problems with it, because he thinks that as soon as prime matter is given form, you have a formed substance. Any form that you get after that is accidental form. So if my prime matter receives a form of corporeality, making it corporeal, then it receives my rational soul, making me a rational bodily thing. I'm a rational animal only accidentally, not essentially. So I'm just accidentally a human. I'm essentially just a bodily thing with no distinction. So arguments like that, Thomas, uses against plurality of forms, but that doesn't get him out of the dilemma. Is matter the principle of potency, form the principle of actuality? Are angels pure actuality, or do they have any potentiality to them? And he says, yes, they do have some kind of potentiality to them. They have the potency to exist. And what we mean by that is they stand in potency to an active existence. And in order to establish that, he has to show that there's distinction between essence and existence in all things. So that's what he has to show. And he devises several arguments in favor of it. Now, my favorite argument that he devises there, the one that I think just myself and John Whipple, I think we're the only defenders of this argument. And John Whipple's dead now, so I don't know. I think I might be the only defender of the argument.
Let's see here. No, Phaser does. He defends it, right?
Well, Phaser, so the argument comes up. There's an argument called the intellectus essentiae argument,
which I know you two differ on that one.
Yeah. Phaser disagrees with me on that. I don't know if he the multiplication argument, if he agrees with me on that.
He does, because he's I guess a little more. I guess he's more of a yes man than you, because he thinks that they're both good.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So he agrees, because I know you don't think that the intellectus argument is standalone.
Yeah.
He does. But then after that, it's been a while since I've revisited his, but at least in his 5 proofs book, he then does go on to give 2 more arguments for the real distinction. One is from the contingency of things, which I actually have some problems with that approach. And then the third one is the multiplicity argument, that if something is essence just is its existence, and it's not susceptible to multiplication. He does. He develops it differently than you. So you guys have a different approach of going about it, but at least he has a general endorsement of it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, the first argument that Thomas comes up with, that intellectus essentiae argument, we may as well, just kind of give it a brief run through for the listeners. Thomas opens by saying, look, whatever doesn't enter into the understanding of an essence or a quiddity is distinct from that essence and composed with it from without. And this is because in order to understand an essence, you need to understand the component parts of it. And if something doesn't enter into that understanding, then it's not a component part of the essence. Now, Thomas argues that, you can take a man or a phoenix and you can understand what it is to be a man or a phoenix, but that doesn't mean you've understood that any man or any phoenixes exist, okay? Because we know that phoenixes don't exist, but yet you can understand what they are. And we can conceive that you can understand just the nature of rational animality without affirming that any men exist. Okay, so you can understand these essences without understanding their existence. So existence is not a component of the essence and is thus distinct from it. Now, Phaser takes that, and others take that to be a standalone argument. I have an issue with it, because I think Thomas is dealing with what logicians have called second intentions. They're not first intentions. He's not dealing with our understanding of actual things here present before us. He's dealing with our thinking about things. And so what he's doing is he's making a distinction between how we think about an essence and how we think about the existence of that essence. So the different intellectual capacities that we have for thinking about either. We don't need to go over sort of our debate on that. It really is just an intra-Thomist debate, because we do agree that at some point Thomas does make the distinction.
Right.
I think he makes it at the next stage. So at the next stage in the Deente, Thomas says, look, imagine the hypothesis of something whose essence is to exist. Its essence just is existence. What it is pure existence, subsistent existence. Thomas holds that, such could only be one and unique. You could have at most one such thing, which is subsistent existence. And that's because it resists all multiplication. It couldn't be multiplied in any way. And Thomas takes us through a few examples of multiplication to make his point. The first is the way that a genus is multiplied into species. So you have the genus animal, and then the different species, sort of rational animal, humans, equine animals, horses, canine animals, dogs. And the way in which the species is multiplied is that you add a differentiating or specifying feature to the genus. It's outside of the genus, and it's added to it, and it distinguishes the genus into its various species. So we add rationality to the genus, we add canininity, all of that to the genus, and that's what gets us the different species. But if something is pure existence, if you have something whose essence is just to exist, it's pure existence itself, there's nothing outside of it which could be added to it to specify it, because everything will stand in potency to it, and so anything that is comes after it. So there's nothing that it stands in potency to in order to be distinguished or multiplied in that way. And then the next argument Thomas devises is that, species are multiplied into individuals by being received in diverse chunks of matter. So the species human is multiplied into individual humans because the species human is received into all these distinct chunks of matter that we all have, all the flesh and bone that all the humans have, which is formed in this way to make us humans. He holds that something which is subsistent existence couldn't be multiplied in this way because then it wouldn't subsist in virtue of what it is. It would subsist in its matter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not in virtue of what it is, but in its matter. So with that, Thomas holds that subsistent existence can't be multiplied. And it's easy to see why, because it doesn't stand in potency to anything which can multiply it or dilute it or in any way. There's nothing that it stands in potency to divide it up. Okay.
Yes. Right. So here, maybe I wonder if you think this is maybe a good way of saying the same thing a little bit differently, right? So you just take the hypothesis that there's something that's just it simply exists, right? On exclamation point. It's ontologically simple, right? And if you ask, well, if there's two instances of this, there's some difference between them. I mean, even if you assume that like IOI is false, I mean, trivially so, there's got to be a difference between two instances of something, right? Even if it's not discernible. But
yeah, go on. Yeah.
Yeah. But I want to say like, whatever the fact that there's two instances means that there's some similarity between them, right? That's expressible in terms of qualities or properties. And so you have this grounding relation, right? And now you have something that is an ontological complex. So maybe the simplest way to say it is that given the hypothetical, multiplication, trying to multiply it would contradict this thing's nature either as simple or self-subsistent or both. Is that the sort of general idea of what's going on? It's the nature of it. It's not right. It's the nature of it that makes it metaphysically unsusceptible to multiplication, right? Without contradicting its actual essence, right?
So I do have a problem with that way of putting things. This idea that if you have, two instances, there has to be something which distinguishes them. I do have a problem with that because I think it draws on sort of issues relating to the identity of indiscernibles and indiscernibility of identicals and all the controversy surrounding that, right. Which generally Thomas is not committed to and is not the way in which he puts forth his argumentation. Putting forth the argument that in that way, I've only ever seen him do it once in all of his works, and it's in a kind of a throwaway argument in the Contra Gentiles. So I don't think it's the way that Thomas approaches his things. I mean, others can approach it in that way, but I just don't think Thomas does. And I don't approach it in that way because the way I approach it is that if you have something which is subsistent existence, there is nothing that it could be subject to which can multiply it. So it's in terms of it's not being in potency to anything, which means that it resists multiplication. So that's the way in which I would develop the argument.
Yeah, right. All right. Yeah, I see the differences there. I guess concerning the IOI issue, I would just say discernible or not, trivially so, there's some difference between two instances of something, right? So I don't even think that would be an issue, right? Otherwise, I think you're just talking straight nonsense, right? But I can also see how you could avoid that issue entirely just by going your direction.
Yeah.
Sure. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know. I mean, in a post-Leibnizian world, the identity of indiscernibles, it brings up issues concerning haketas, and whether or not form is universal.
Right.
And so it really does open up a can of worms concerning the metaphysics of form and universality, realism and nominalism.
Yep.
And I mean, that's something that a Thomist will have something to say about. But I think, for this issue, you kind of just don't need to go down that rabbit hole.
Entirely. Yeah. Good. There are a number of other. So I agree with you. I think that approach. I've always been attracted to the multiplicity argument against once you kind of have a general motivation for Aquinas's theory of existence. There's a number of other approaches that, at least, I don't know how much they're found explicitly in Aquinas, but that other Thomists have used to motivate the real distinction. I'm sure you're familiar with any number of these thinkers. I'm just curious if there's any that you find attractive, worth considering, discussing, or if you just think that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just to get to the real distinction, Thomas reasons that.
Sorry, we're skipping a step. Yeah, go ahead.
If pure existence is such that it couldn't be multiplied in any way, it's just impossible for it to be multiplied, then regardless of whether or not pure existence exists, regardless of whether or not there is pure subsistent existence, we know that is impossible, that for anything which is multiple, that it would be pure existence, that it would be something in which essence and existence are identical. Given that we know that that's an impossibility, then it's a real impossibility. So anything which is multiple is not something which is pure existence, i.e. is not something in which essence and existence are identical, in which case it's something in which essence and existence are distinct. So whatever is subject to multiplicity is something in which you have distinction of essence and existence. And we have real multiple things, in which case in those things you have distinction of essence and existence.
Yeah. Now, just because there's just lots of things, right?
Yeah.
And given the prior impossibility from the hypothetical, that then gives Aquinas the real distinction he needs to then run his cosmological argument to demonstrate that the hypothetical is actual, right?
Yeah, 100%. So, you ask about different arguments for real distinction. They're the very solid ones that you find in St. Thomas. Elsewhere, you get defenses of argumentation from real distinction based on the efficiently caused character of existence and things. And I know Joseph Owens is a big fan of that it's only when you can show that existence is efficiently caused that you can demonstrate real distinction of essence and existence, because of real distinction between effect and cause. Obviously, to show that existence is caused, you need to have a cause of existence, which means that you need a proof of God. So any proof of God that you have can't be one which presupposes that essence and existence are distinct. So that's going to mean that the type of argument you defend for God's existence can't be that type, which presupposes real distinction.
Yeah, you need something else, right?
Yeah. Others use contingency and focus on the contingency of things coming in and out of existence, and they think that that's enough to show that essence and existence are distinct, because if something can come in and out of existence, then it's not identical to the existence that it has. And there's a few other arguments. One is a genus argument, that if something is a member of a genus or within a species which is a member of a genus, it's not something in which essence and existence are identical, because its essence is constituted out of all these different factors which are not identical to existence. And Whipple goes through a number of them in his big book, Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas.
Yep. Yeah. And Father Thomas Joseph White, I think, is fond of the genus argument. So if people want to get a little bit more on that, they can check out some of his work. Okay, good. Well, that just gives people some more options for exploration. That's great. That satisfies me. Shall we switch now to some epistemology?
Yeah, sure. That was my first love, epistemology. So
yeah. So here's a question that I've been kind of thinking about for a while, and I've been surprised, and I know I've complained about this to you, Gavin, at the apparent lack of literature concerning divine epistemology. Right?
Yeah.
And I get it. Like, maybe it's just because, however difficult it is to know what it is like to be a bat, it's going to be infinitely more difficult to know what it is like to be God, right? But I've always been curious like if there might not be, and I guess it's going to depend on what your general epistemology is anyways, whether you think this is even needed. Like, I guess if like you've got like a very strong internalism and you're not concerned about like skeptical scenarios and stuff, this doesn't interest you. But I've always like wondered if there isn't something about classical theism and the commitments that come along with that could give us, a sort of an anchor for epistemology in divine simplicity. And let me motivate it just through the kind of odd question of this, of like, how would God know that he's not a brain in a vat, right? And that's interesting to think about. And I guess if you think that we can know that we're not brains in a vat, you could just translate that answer. But maybe you're not super confident in like a lot of the answers that have been given on that front. One thought that I had is, okay, there's philosophers have, and you'll probably think about this totally differently. Let me get it out there, right? Is philosophers have, over the course of history, like identified conditions that seem to invite skepticism or doubt. For Descartes, he thinks it's, the disconnect between intellect and will. Others say it's propositional or representational knowledge. James Ross thinks it's imagination, right? He calls imagination the master of falsity. Like, this is the reason that we can go wrong. And at the very least, something that's interesting that I've thought about with classical theism and divine simplicity is that through the apophatic approach and the commitment of simplicity, it's like none of these things would seem to apply to God. God doesn't have propositional representational knowledge. God's knowledge is executive. It's not passive. It's not received. God doesn't have imagination, as weird as that sounds. If you understand imagination is the way Ross is saying it. So like maybe at the very least you could say, I don't know how, like the mechanics of how God, knows he's with certainty he's not in a skeptical scenario, but there seems to be something here, a stripping away process to show that like, however God knows, there's reason to think that it's a radically different mode of knowledge than we have. And it doesn't invite or it doesn't contain certain conditions that invite skepticism. You see what I'm kind of at least gesturing at, right? I'll let you clean up the mess from there and take it whatever direction you want, right?
Yeah. So again, I mean, starting off from the post-Kantian background, I think generally in philosophy, when you adopt a sort of a post-Kantian position, skeptical problems it's very difficult for skeptical problems to emerge. And this is because on a Kantian view, which I also think is, close to the Thomist view as well, you have these recognitional capacities, these categories, and these are brought into operation by something other than the categories. So if these recognitional capacities for, a recognitional capacity for causality is brought into operation, well, it's because there's something like causality bringing it into operation. There's homogeneity or conformity of mind and world. Kant famously says, and, in the Critique, it's the conformity of, world to mind, meaning that what he means there is that the features of the world conform to these recognitional capacities that we have. Not that the mind structures the world in some sort of way, but there's homogeneity between how the world is such that it can bring into operation these features of the intellect. And I think the same is going on in Aquinas there. So I think just on that basis, skeptical problems don't emerge. But it is an interesting question. How would God know that he's not a brain in a vat? And I want to distinguish between discussion of the mechanisms of cognition and the phenomenology of cognition.
Right.
So there's a mechanisms of cognition. So let's just talk about human beings, for instance. There's a mechanisms of cognition which are the same in human beings, agent intellect, passive intellect, all of that. And we have those same mechanisms because we're the same types of thing. But I think as Heidegger has kind of, pointed out, if you're in a different mood or different things are going on, there's a certain phenomenology to how we engage with the world, and we start seeing things in the world differently based on our differing existential situation within the world. So we've got these same mechanisms, but they can be colored. There can be a different phenomenology to them. Now, the phenomenology of God's cognition is radically closed off to us right now until we get to the beatific vision. Okay. And then we'll get a taste of what it's like. But the mechanisms we can talk about, because we can reason about the mechanisms, we can talk about them objectively. And so when we're talking about intelligence, what it is to be intelligent is to have the form of a thing in oneself without becoming the thing whose form it is. Okay, that's what it is to be intelligent, to possess the form of something other than oneself without thereby becoming that thing. So, a tree does not receive the form of a statue without becoming a statue. Like, let's say a tree doesn't receive the form of an elephant without becoming a carving of an elephant, ceasing to be a tree and now just becoming wood carved into an elephant. Whereas I can receive the form of an elephant and not become an elephant. Okay. I can do that by understanding the form of the elephant. Now, God, as pure existence itself, possesses every possible form of existence. So in God, there is every possible form of existence because the forms of he is pure existence itself, and any form of existence is just some sort of form of existence, which God is. But given simplicity, and I know I haven't gone over simplicity, but given simplicity, God isn't identical to any of those forms, in which case he has the forms, but is not identical to them, in which case he has them in an intelligent manner. Now, when we're intelligent, okay, when we understand something, we understand in terms of a species. And a species is the likeness of the form of the thing we understand. It's the intelligible species, okay? So when I think about a tree, I think about the tree in virtue of this intelligible species. When I think about a cat, in terms of the intelligible species of a cat, and those species are formed in a certain way. And one intelligible species can let us understand lots of diverse things, okay? So I can have the intelligible species of tree, and that means I can understand that all of these things, which are different types of trees, are trees, okay? So one, more, say, universal intelligible species allows us to understand less universal things. Now, the intelligible species by which God understands is the divine essence, which he just is, okay? Pure existence itself. So the intelligible species by which God understands is just pure existence. So God understands every form of pure existence. But given divine simplicity, God's intellect is identical to the divine essence, distinct in sense, but identical in reference. Okay, so God's intellect is identical to the divine essence. So the intelligible species by which God understands is the divine essence, which God is. So how does God know that he's not a brain in a vat? He's identical to the intelligible species which he understands and which he is. So the species by which he understands is him, the divine essence itself, and that's not a brain in a vat, so he knows he's not a brain in a vat.
Yeah, it's pretty wild stuff, isn't it? But like, you see how it all connects, and it's like, it's really nice within this particular metaphysical system, right? And maybe that would be reason, because here's a reason, right? If you think that God is perfect, you would think that God has to know he's not. Like, it would be a deficiency, right, to not know whether or not you're in a skeptical scenario, right? So maybe you would think if it's possible that there's a perfect being, right, I should be able to have some sort of metaphysical system where I can at least be able to say something like you said, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if I have or don't have a metaphysical system, I don't have like at least something of an answer to that issue, I don't know, maybe that's a problem. What do you think?
Yeah. I think that every epistemology, every theory of knowledge, and every sort of skeptical situation always presupposes some sort of metaphysics, something on the philosophy of being. It's presupposing that in order to motivate its position. And then the question is the epistemologist in question aware of that? Or is the epistemologist in question being sort of fully honest about that? Descartes, for instance, has a very, clear metaphysics of what the human being is when he's doing his epistemology. The only way that you can motivate methodic doubt is if you already presuppose that there's a chasm between mind and world, that there is a mind and that it's distinct from world, and so there's a chasm between the two. And how do we know that the mind's representations of the world are correct? Right. That clearly that clearly presupposes first of all, a nominalist account of things, which we can get into, but also secondly, a view that mind is something radically different from world, and the world can't be fitted into the mind, in which case we need these representations called ideas which enter into the mind. And that's right at the very beginning of the Meditations. Okay, so he's presupposing that metaphysics of mind already, and he just doesn't say anything about it. He didn't seem to be conscious of it. Didn't seem to be aware of it. So, yeah, I do think all sorts of skeptical scenarios, epistemologies, all presupposing metaphysics, something that it's like to be a thing which is a knower. And I think we should just be honest and conscious of our metaphysics beforehand.
Yeah, excellent. Tremendous, Gavin. This has been great. I know we got to wrap up here in a few minutes. So before we go, what do you currently, I know you're super busy with, all the different roles, but what are you currently working on? And what can we bug you to come chat about in the future is what I'm asking, right? Yeah.
So I'm editing a volume for Cambridge on Thomism Revisited. So I'm getting down to the last few chapters, just at the busiest time of the academic year, but I'm getting down to the last few chapters. So that is coming up with Cambridge. Working on that. I've got a piece on a volume on the Summa Contra Gentiles I have due in a week or two, and that's going to be on divine simplicity and creation. I have a piece coming out in New Blackfriars on how to read, first of all, how to read Scripture, and what Scripture then can tell us about kind of, God's response to human suffering. So I have this, sort of view about reading Scripture, that the literal sense of Scripture that Thomas holds, and the spiritual sense as a secondary sense, is motivated by a certain kind of metaphysical approach that he takes, and that gives us a kind of way to think about the response to human suffering. That's coming out in New Blackfriars. In fact, I just got the proofs for it.
Awesome.
I have to work through those. Let me see what else. My resurrection book, I'm on to the final chapter.
I was going to ask about that. I mean, we've been waiting for this one. Yeah.
Oh God, I know. And now that I'm working with Stacey on the philosophy of matter, and whether or not physical corporeal matter can be reformed and refashioned after being deformed, all of that sort of good stuff, can we still affirm physical resurrection in a post-Newtonian world? All of that. Well, yes, we can. And now that I'm working with Stacey, that's going to get even more informed.
Yeah, that's exciting. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
Doing that. And then other than that, I've got a BJJ competition coming up in a few weeks.
Excellent.
Staying busy on the martial arts front, and doing all my registrar stuff and academic administration and dean stuff here at St. Patrick's.
Yeah, awesome. Well, a lot of good stuff that I'm looking forward to, especially the volume on Thomism, the resurrection book, and I'll bug you to send me the New Blackfriars piece too as well. So good stuff, Gavin. Thank you so much. Appreciate you being here. And if everybody enjoyed the episode, please check out Gavin's books. Got to get a plug in for those. Aquinas' Way to God, The Metaphysics of Creation. I'll be sure to link those and some of our previous conversations in the show notes. We'll see everybody next time. Take care.
Thank you.